Yeah, so I've recently switched over to work in Australia, but I'd like to spend today talking about some issues, the diversity of farms in Eastern and Southern Africa and what that means for what kind of intensification options exist there. So, and this work was part of the SIMLESA project, which I'll expand on a little bit. But some of the people we've worked with include Casper Roxburgh, who has left, but he was one of the first people that I worked with, and he's the second author on this book, which is going to be a major piece of discussion for today. Peter DeVoyle and Daniel Rodriguez, I work with both of them closely in Toowoomba and Gatton, and John Dixon, associated with QAAFI. Paswell is an economist at CIMMIT, and Sieg Snap at MSU have also really informed the content of this book and another manuscript that I'll talk about. So today, I'll talk about this book. It's also free, so take it. And I was excited to print out as many as they would let me. So really, there's more than this. If you want, I have a few boxes stored. And then, so I'll talk about that, and then I'll go on. This one really focuses on what opportunities exist, and I'll explain how I understand what an opportunity is. And then the second part of the talk is looking at the benefits of those options. So a little bit of background. We're a farming systems research group. I mentioned Daniel Rodriguez, Joe. We all work in the farming systems research group, which pretty much means that we're interested in outcomes at the whole farm level. And outcomes at the whole farm level involve an understanding of all the things that influence those outcomes at the whole farm level, which, so when we talk about the whole farm, we talk about many components, and this is just a simple representation of some of the things we might consider. So there's lots of things that go into it. It includes climate, policies, markets, infrastructure. Some of those things can influence farm decisions and the outcomes. And then we have things like at the subsystem level, soil, farm size, field management practices, and yield. But then those also interact with community. So the community might also, so the community subsystem is multiple fields, multiple paddocks, multiple field management styles. And then we also have along there institutions, banks, and then we have outcomes, which today I'll be talking about food availability as the outcome that I'm interested in, but it could also be services, environmental services, and then what that means scaling up and out for broader population patterns. So when you consider all those, I think this is useful when you have a lot of these things interacting to influence the outcome. Maybe there are some contexts where you don't have a lot of, these things don't influence each other so much, so you can focus on one of these areas and not pay as much attention to the interactions, but we really think that there are a lot of systems that benefit from looking at these interactions to help us understand how we have trade-offs and synergies that can occur. So then what I'm interested in looking at is we have diversity in all these farming systems. So in the farming systems that were especially, that this project was focused on, we looked in 5 different countries in Eastern and Southern Africa, Ethiopia, Kenya, Malawi, Mozambique, and Tanzania. And within those countries, there's a lot of different types of farming systems. So when you have diversity, the way that I think of it is you also have that diversity can be understood as disparities. And disparities are often discussed in terms of wealth gaps or health disparities, but that can really be along any kind of spectrum of, or any kind of variable that can influence outcomes. And so disparities in these communities can influence the kind of risk that those farms face and their opportunities and the benefits that come from intensification practices, and that can operate to reinforce poverty traps. So that's systemic inequality, pretty much. So at the same time that you reinforce poverty traps, you can stimulate economic and social growth. And so we're using that to figure out what kind of to define our recommendation domains. And so the question that we were interested in with the SEMLESA project is what combinations of farmers' intensification practices offer opportunities to benefit target populations. And I'm highlighting opportunities now because we're at the first half of this talk where I'm talking about the opportunities. But then we'll look at the benefits after that. So we worked for 9 years, between 2010 and 2019. I came in towards the end of that project, so I just had a lot of data to play with. Didn't do as much in the field, but I'll show you what we did with the data. What happened was we collected a lot of household, how many households was it? I have some numbers listed in the next slides, but it was many thousands of household surveys were conducted, and with that, we first we looked at all of the variables that were included in these household surveys, which included some of the things that I highlighted in the farming systems diagram. So some of that involved what kind of management practices that they were currently practicing and practiced for the last few years, but it was also household level demographic information, household size, education levels, and from that, the first step is we have a very, I don't know how many of you have worked with farmer surveys or any kind of social surveys, but there's a whole lot of variables that, I mean, how do you begin to make meaning out of that? So with the best, the most smartly designed surveys, you still have to do something with that. So principal component analysis is a very common way of reducing the dimensions in your data set. So we do that, and what principal component analysis does is it's also a way of identifying the variables that are most variable. So it kind of highlights the major differences, and that's where my attention goes for the rest of the analysis, is I focus on that, and I understand how some of those big variables that explain a lot of the variance are also correlated with other variables that I can look at later. But for now, we reduce the variables we're looking at, and then we cluster farming systems by those variables, and then I go in, so this is just clustering them, and then I go in and describe those farms. And that's pretty much what I did for this book. So this is basic stuff, everyone can do it, and I include the R script and a link to the R script in the back of this presentation and also in the book at the end. So you take the R file and run some survey data with it and contact me when you say there's all these errors and it's a sloppy script, but I think it should work for you. So this is the kind of data that we get when we do that. I have selected, so what you'll see, these are the cluster variables. So this is what came out of the PCA analysis. I select one variable with the highest loading value, and if this doesn't mean anything to you, it's not critical for this conversation, but I select one variable from each principal component analysis. And so this is one subregion in Ethiopia that I looked at, and I do each subregion separately because they're very different. So I already started by looking within subregions. And I took the cluster and I took these variables in the Central Rift Valley of Ethiopia, and some of the major differences we observed were in the asset value of the farm, the total livestock units, their experience growing maize, man equivalents, so the labor that was available, technology factor, so how much we had a few different technologies and converted that into an index. And then we have distance to water and distance to seed markets. So that was what was highlighted in the Central Rift Valley. What's interesting is, what I wanted to highlight here was that in another region, this is a semi-arid region of Ethiopia, we have different sources of variance. So the highlighted bits are different. So drought frequency, the farms in the semi-arid region, there were some that were much more exposed to drought than others. That wasn't really in the Central Rift Valley, you didn't have drought as something that was differently experienced across the farm systems. So that's some way that we begin to understand that, and then we summarize that. And so for instance, in the Central Rift Valley, we have one group, the CRV1, tends to, let's see, so they are closer to water and markets, but they also have fewer total assets. So I would say that they have greater access to a few things, but they also have some challenges in investing in these. The markets might be close, but they don't have as much to invest in. So those are some ways that I start to think about what that means and what kind of options they have. All right, so from this, I look at a few key indicators to help me continue to think about what are these separate groups. What are their strengths or what are their advantages and disadvantages in terms of and how does that influence their production opportunities? So I look along a few different metrics associated with food security, socioeconomic, mobility, and economic outcomes. So each one of these rows is one of those groups. So one of them is CRV1. And so each one here is one of those groups. And and the color here is, if it's darker, it is a bigger number. So you can see that this group has a lot of land. So that's what this heat map is telling us. And so I can break these groups up into, now we have high food availability and low food availability according to their land area, livestock owned, and consumption equivalents. I could do the same thing for some of these social mobility metrics, which includes education, proximity to markets, and probability of male-headed households, of having a male-headed household. And then look at some of their crop income and off-farm income and other forms of income. And what I make of this is we have some farms like this who make a lot of crop income and other income, not so much off-farm income. So that to me says this is a commercial farmer, in contrast to one that makes a lot of off-farm income here. And this white indicates very low crop income and other income. So this group I treat them, I consider them differently as off-farm workers. These top 3 are all socially mobile, and then they have relatively high food availability. One thing I haven't highlighted is this is all relative. So it doesn't mean you have enough food, but it means you have more food than these groups here. So the high food available, socially mobile commercial farmers, this 1%, that is when I look at those, they have high human and financial capacity to invest, and they would likely, so they would likely benefit. One thing that we see is that in terms of, they're socially mobile, but their proximity to markets is notably low relative to some of these other things. So if you wanted to support intensification here, one of the, a recommendation I would make would be increase access to markets. And if they did have access to that, bargaining power and everything that comes with operating in a marketplace. Then you have a group like this where you have low food availability, socially immobile, low income. And when I look at these, I also look at how I've summarized each individual group here. And each one, you do see a lot of variability. And so I'm just reporting some of the similarities within these groups. So this group, I would say, this is more about poverty reduction than it is about intensification. And what I see here is that land area is particularly low. So access to land is one thing I would start to look into. And then, we have another group here, which I'm calling an off-farm worker. High education, very close to markets, no land, no livestock. Those are, and when I look at this group and how I've summarized it and the other indicators I have for these, they're very young. As you can see, they're educated, and they tend to have few physical assets. So they're young families with very little to invest with, but they're educated. So access to land, sure, but also different types of job markets that involve, that are knowledge intensive perhaps. So that's how I think about some of this. And then I've done that for all of these countries. And one thing that I wanted to show here was how this group that I consider a priority for targeting for intensification, this constitutes 15% of the surveyed farms in Mozambique. In Kenya, it's 39%. In Tanzania, it's 16%. In Malawi, it's 42%. So that might also inform how you want to distribute your funds. So take-home messages for these options is the farms best positioned for intensification tend to be those that have more food and are commercial producers. That's kind of by definition. That's what that's how I've started to think about it. And then the common advantages that I see when I go back to a table like this is that they have high levels of access to labor and they have extensive social networks. So so these are things, and like I said before, access to markets and bargaining tools. And then we have the other group that's more at-risk, food insecure groups. And when I say insecure, I'm not using it technically. It's just that they had lower food availability relative to the other groups. But they tended to represent extreme ends of the age distribution. So I highlighted the very young group in the previous slide, but they were either very young or very old. And the very young tended to be those that were highly educated and had few financial resources. Very old are a little bit different. They don't have that education, and they tend to have land. So, so those are some things to think about when you're, if you wanted to target, these are different goals. One is how do we get more intensification in farms? Another one is how do we combat food insecurity or alleviate poverty. But here, if you wanted to do that, job markets for knowledge-intensive tasks for those young ones, or assisted living services, or something that is more suitable for that demographic. That's the first half. So the second half was more looking at what are the consequences for some of these recommendation domains that I introduced in the first part. So I'm looking at outcomes in terms of food availability. So this is a little bit of background about what food availability looks like. I thought this was really an easy thing to interpret. There's a big red dot here that's taking up much of the circle in Africa. And that red dot is the proportion of the population with severe food insecurity. So yeah, you see less green, more red. That's a big part of the population's food insecure. This is the worldwide, what it looks like when you put us all together. If you look at Northern America and Europe, you see that dot's much smaller. So that's what we're looking at that's all of Africa. One of my pet peeves is talking about all of Africa together, like it's the same. It's not. So if you look just within Ethiopia, you do see that the number of people undernourished, which is the black line, is decreasing, and so is the prevalence, or the percentage of the population that's undernourished. This is FAO stats. There's a way that they estimate what undernourished is, probably filled with assumptions, but that's the general trend that we're looking at. The average food availability levels have increased by 41%. So I'm looking at Ethiopia and Mozambique now, rather than 5 different countries. Now with Mozambique, we see something slightly different, I mean, this is increasing. So the black line, again, is the number of people undernourished, and you can see that it really started to shift in 2011, starting with some political instability, inflation, rise in food prices, starting with, these kind of continue to snowball out. So what we see is that their recent history is pretty different from Ethiopia. So I think that those two countries are kind of interesting to do together. And this is a little bit of the work that's been done by some people around here. So food availability predictors have been identified, and a lot of surveys have tried to figure out what drives food availability, and these are some of the easiest rules of thumb. Household size, smaller the fewer mouths to feed, the easier it is to feed them. Number of livestock, and land area. So the more livestock you have, the more land you have, the more you can eat, the more food you have. And then this is kind of interesting that all of the relationship between how sensitive you are to that increase in land area depends on how close you are to markets. So another big one is climate. So this is rainfall histories. That's another commonly cited one. And this is the data from Ethiopia and Mozambique that I used for this analysis. So what we've done is we've converted, we've taken a gridded data, historic data, and then compared 2010, 2013, and 2015, which were the survey years. We've compared those years, and I did annual, and I also just did the most recent season the most recent to the survey, to when the survey was taken, and compared that year or season to the long-term history, and got the difference and divided by the average. And that's an anomaly ratio. And so the bluer it is, the wetter it is, the redder it is, the drier it is. So this is one of the ways that, this is one of the variables that we looked at. So this is what is known, or what has been done about food availability outcomes from intensification, and generally they're thought to reduce the risk. Like, that's great. But and that complementary adoption, when complementary practices are jointly adopted, it's even better. So, so that's great. Some examples from Malawi show that that's increased that improves maize variety together with soil and water conservation, increased food availability. But what I find really interesting is how it's unevenly distributed across diverse farming systems. So, what we see is that it's especially that unevenness of the distribution of benefits is often across the same factors that predict baseline risk levels. So it's a situation where if you're more at risk, you're also less likely to benefit. Like, that's great news. This is examples. This is increasing cultivated land area, so not a great example for intensification, but this was an interesting one where the benefits of doing that were lower for female-headed households and access to markets, because female-headed households didn't have as much bargaining power in the markets, for example. So what this analysis that I did does is look at what combination of intensification practices benefited the populations, particularly at high risk for food shortages in Ethiopia and Mozambique. We can compare that to the lower risk groups. So, when I say high risk, I mean they have a very high likelihood of having some kind of food deficit. So the way that I figured out if they had a high likelihood of having a food deficit was first by the surveys we had a nice job of capturing all these food sources, and the contribution of each one of these food sources, it can also really vary a lot across farming systems. And so you'll have studies that just look at household crop production and increasing that alone, but you're missing possibly some major sources of food if you just look at one of those things. So we really tried to capture all of these food sources. And so from this, we have stock before harvest, so we have some that's in storage and what's harvested. And through this flow, we end up getting the food available and then comparing that to the food that's demanded. And there are a bunch of assumptions about how much food is demanded. I know it depends on how I feel every day about how much food I demand, but generally 2,100 kilocalories and 60 grams of protein per consumption equivalent per day. A consumption equivalent is a standardized way of thinking about a human based on their age and their gender. So apparently women don't eat as much as men, and I can argue with that, but there's that. And then from that, you can get whether you have enough food. And I looked, as you can see, in terms of calories and protein. So that gives me 4 different possible outcomes. This is total available protein and total available energy. In this quadrant, you have enough energy and protein. In this quadrant, you don't have enough of either. Sometimes you get enough protein and not enough energy. That's pretty strange. That's the keto, keto diet, one of those. And in other cases, and more often, if you have one deficit, it's going to be in protein. So maize helps us out a lot. And so those are the 4 different outcomes, and this is what it looked like for Ethiopia and Mozambique. And I really like this laser pointer, apparently. I'm using it a lot. So from that, we have, that's my outcome of interest. And now we're going to model that outcome and identify the factors that, so the first thing I'll do is identify factors that predict the predictors of food availability. And the way I start to do that is good old principal component analysis first to deal with multi-collinearity and also to start by emphasizing these major sources of variance, which I think in the first part of this I tried to establish that there's some merit to doing that highlighting those disparities is a nice way to start to think about communities. And then I used multinomial logic regression equations to model food availability, where we had 4 different outcomes. The baseline is having enough, and then it's what factors are going to increase the chance that you don't have enough, if that makes sense. So baselines, you're good, but then if you have too many mouths to feed at some point, you're going to have a much higher risk of having a food deficit. So with that modeling, I could identify the significant predictors, and with regression trees, I could pick threshold values where at this point you have too many mouths to feed, or whatever it is. And then from that, I can again model food availability for specific target groups. So at that point, I have high-risk groups, low-risk groups, and I can go, and for each one of those, I can look at how management practices can predict food availability within those groups. So, so this is the, when I'm modeling food availability in Ethiopia using the variables that I identified in principal component analysis. These are the variables that come out as significant predictors of food availability. So having more livestock, so TLU is total livestock units. If you have more than 3, then then this is you. And 60% of those farms have adequate food, energy, and protein. This is only a energy deficit, not so common. 16% have a protein deficit, and 23% have a energy and protein deficit. But this is the first splitting off point. So how many TLUs do you have? Just let me know that. And then the next part is what's the rain looked like in the last season. And this is an anomaly ratio if it's less than -0.1, which is dry. So this is a little bit of a interesting and something that I wouldn't have anticipated finding. But if it's drier, so this is a wetter than usual farm, and 49% have a food deficit, food and energy and protein deficit. Compared to if you have a drier than usual season, 21% have an energy and protein deficit. And I'm continuing to understand, to better understand this, but so this is the first step of creating, this is my low-risk group, my high-risk group. And from that, I take each group separately, so high risk, is on this side now, low risk on this side, and I model food availability with a range of management practice combinations, and I only do it for the management practices that are represented across all of these. So these are the management practices that I look at are those that the surveyed households use, and they use them frequently. They're represented enough across all of the farms that I can do this kind of analysis, so I'm limited with the management practices I can look at, but this worked out pretty well where you can see how adding an additional management practice to a package influences outcomes. So high-risk group looks like some low investment. This is the lowest investment compared to these, which is a bigger package. Fertilizer, improved seed, plus herbicide. The gray is when you don't use that, and the red is when you do. So you can see that that box shifted, and this is in the direction of having more protein. And if you add manure, it also moves up a little bit. So this is an interesting stepwise adoption option, I think, for a high-risk group to start with a basic set of management practices. It's not necessarily easy to acquire all these things, but it's less than these. So start with this, add on manure, and those benefits are going to add on too. For a group that's already has a lot of food, it's also uncommon that they just use these things. But you'll see that this low-risk group doesn't benefit that much from a few practices. In contrast, when you look down here, this is where you really see some bang for your buck, but you don't see it if you're high risk. It goes up, but it doesn't go up that much. It doesn't go up significantly. But if you look here, it went up drastically. So this is an example where you have low risk. This is our low risk group. They can invest in high cost, high returns for a low risk group. Low cost, medium returns for a high risk group. And we do this with Mozambique also. And here, the number of mouths that you need to feed is going to make a difference in terms of what your risk levels are. So if you have above 3.9 consumption equivalents or standardized people in your house, then you have 71% of those households had enough food and had a deficit, did not have enough energy and did not have enough protein. If you had less mouths to feed, then it was 44% of those households had an energy and protein deficit. So that's the difference between 70% and 44% is the number of mouths you have to feed. And then again, it's the anomaly ratio, what the rainfall looked like, and the land area under cultivation. So from here I get my, this is low risk to high risk groups. And so when we look here at high risk, we see something different in Mozambique where these are the management practices that were used enough for me to do this analysis. Crop residue retention didn't do much for that low risk group. They needed either improved seed and then crop residue retention plus minimum tillage did lift up, get the upper limit higher, but there's also a lot of, it still goes pretty low. And then, again, with the low-risk group, you have a lot more benefit coming from this crop residue plus minimum tillage gets you further than the high-risk group. So some take-home messages for this section was they did reduce, there were a few examples where it actually, the management practices didn't really reduce the risk at all, or it even increased the risk. But generally, where intensification practices made an impact was in either the high or low risk households. It was not observed in the medium risk farms, which in terms of numbers, that's the majority of farms that we looked at. So not much was happening, so high investment packages really gave the low risk households the greatest potential to benefit from intensification. So intensification, from this I'd conclude that intensification really has the greatest potential for the low risk farms. But then food availability for the majority of surveyed households is probably more limited by other factors that are not gonna, so they weren't as sensitive to any kind of change in management, which suggests that something else is going on, which wouldn't surprise me too much. So outside of what you do on farm, there's markets and political dynamics and other things. So there might be a few other little hammers that we need to use to address a lot of the medium risk majority of farms. So that's it. I mentioned the majority of, or I mentioned earlier that if you want, take a book, and all the script that I used to do this analysis is available. It's also, all this is online, so you don't need a physical book if you don't want a physical book. It's also online. The book and the GitHub repository has the R script, and these are some future readings if you're really interested in some of this. It's some papers that I reference throughout. So, and thank you to Simlesa and CIMMYT, Ethiopia, Kenya, Malawi, Mozambique, and Tanzania, and the Farming Systems Research Group. Thank you.